Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Schwantner, and I have a great pleasure and honor to introduce you Associate Professor Dr. Jamin Pelkey from Toronto, who came to us to present this lecture about In Between Inhuman Extremes, Focal Images of the Domination-Alienation Nexus. Who is Dr. Jamin Pelkey? I have some notes here. He is Program Director in the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, and a core member of the Ryerson York Graduate Program in Communication and Culture. Jamin is a specialist in anthropology and linguistics. His areas of specialization include philosophy of language, embodied cognition, Tibeto-Burman linguistics, historical linguistics, Charles Sanders Peirce, and semiotics. Dr. Pelkey published the first two monographs about dialectology as dialectic in De Gruyter, where he defined the Fula ethnolinguistic groups of China and Vietnam, identifying 18 new languages through mixed methods, fieldwork, and analysis. His latest research focuses on language evolution and embodied cognition, leading to the publication of his third authored book, The Semiotics of X. This lecture is, I think, based on some ideas that you can find in this book, and I will send you to look into this great volume. Also, Jamin now edited major reference work, Bloomsbury's Semiotics, which is 4-volume, and it's a marvelous project, kind of a map of semiotic field from past to present. Also, Jamin is published a lot of articles in semiotica, science system studies, and so on, and he's a co-chief editor of the most prestigious journal in our field, Semiotica. So please welcome Dr. Jamin Pelkey, please.
I've been looking forward to coming to Prague for a long time, especially because Martin and Michal and several other colleagues have been able to come to the Semiotic Society of America a number of times in the States, and that's where we first met. I stand here. Okay, all right. I'm going to be talking about some research that I had already done, refocusing it through the lens of the project here, this concept of focal images, which I think is still emerging, and so I'm excited about the developments and hope to participate in the conversation. The research that I'm doing related to embodied cognition is also related to trying to understand the human predicament. Not only what does it mean to be human in a hopeful, positive sense, but what are the predicaments and the impossibilities that being human introduces that we can puzzle through. One of the key concepts to keep in mind for this talk, I'm not going to mention it that much during the talk, but it sort of lays at the background, is the problem, a uniquely human problem of solipsism. And you could say that it's a modern problem. And you could also say it's a straw man problem, because no one really believes, it would be impossible to believe that you're the only person alive. But a lot of our philosophical ruminations and publications and activities and conversations imply that minds can be cut off from other minds. The problem has a kind of intuitive appeal, because really we can't firsthand experience someone else's consciousness, or it seems like that on self-reflection. But it quickly becomes a straw man argument to call someone a solipsist, because no one actually believes that in real life, that there aren't other minds. It's what Charles Sanders Peirce calls paper doubts, mere mere phantasms of imagination. But the philosophical approaches to epistemology, theory of knowledge, could be, according to a semiotician I respect, John Deely, could be equated with solipsism. And this is something that's not usually considered. Deely hasn't had many people buy into this critique, but it's worth considering that epistemology, theory of knowledge itself, is a kind of solipsistic doctrine because it assumes that what we know and how we know it are fundamentally two separate things. When if we really think back to how we've evolved from the universe, we might consider the possibility, it's more plausible, that what we know and how we know it are in continuity with each other, so that our minds are not cut off from the universe, not cut off from each other. The social world is not cut off from the natural. But our society for the past 400 years, global society, globalized society in particular, has come to assume or pretend at mass scale that what we know and how we know it are somehow cut off from each other. Now, that's a really boring segue into a really fascinating topic. It's what's at stake, though, so I want to throw it out there up front and then try to give you a better sense of where I'm going, what a deeper problem is, because I think that's a superficial problem. It's deep at a philosophical level, but it's not deep at an evolutionary level. The deeper problem that I'm concerned with in this talk is the bodily evolutionary roots of the contemporary inhuman predicament, because they're poorly understood. And this includes relationships between extreme domination and extreme alienation. That's the aspect of the problem that I want to focus on in this talk. I find that comparative analysis of human artistic, mythic, and archetypal creations offer us insight into understanding this dialectic, you could call it. And the particular kind of mythic, archetypal creations that I'm going to look at are both created in the United States, but they've sort of been globally disseminated because of some of the earlier dynamics that I was mentioning, for better or for worse. Vin Diesel, and Rami Malek as Xander Cage and Elliot Anderson. These two, I'm selecting them for reasons that will become a bit clearer momentarily, but they're mutually defining pairs as archetypes. And they also undermine other mutually defining pairs that I'm going to talk about, in particular Superman and James Bond. And I'm going to argue that paying attention to these interrelations, their sources and their consequences, provides layers of insight into the contemporary human predicament and its deep evolutionary roots. I'm developing this concept of focal images from the research project here and trying to understand it better. I'll also look at some film clips, movie posters, and representations of extreme body posture known as spread eagle from multiple different sources, including prehistoric sources. I'll be drawing on thought of C.S. Peirce, A.J. Gramos, Merleau-Ponty, Maxine Sheets-Johnstone, and a number of others in the process. All right, an introduction to the focal images themselves, you could argue, is a collection of movie posters, but I'm thinking of them, I'm thinking of the actual series that they represent. In the first case, the film series Triple X, which debuted in 2002 and then has had 4 follow-up sequel films. And another one, I'm told, is in the works. And then Mr. Robot, a streaming series that's gone through 4 seasons. In 2019, the season 4 was supposedly its final season. I'm not sure if you're familiar with either one of these. and I'm not recommending them. I'm not a fan of either one of them. I actually really tried to like Mr. Robot, but like halfway through season 2, I just couldn't take it anymore. But I think paying close attention to both of them is really invaluable. It can really be helpful for understanding what the hell is going on. Oh, I just said that on the internet here. Anyways, so we're going to be looking at these images for now. Just think about them in relation to each other. Göran Sonesson, a semiotician whose work I admire and respect, argues that the only way to do semiotics is by doing comparative analyses. Unless you're comparing something, especially cultural semiotics, unless you're doing comparative work, you can't really understand what things mean. And I think comparing these two to each other, understanding how they're in relation to each other, and what they mean for our own human predicament is really important. Let's start by looking at Rami Malek. I don't think this is going to play. It didn't before anyways, so that's why I have it queued up over here. Rami Malek's Mr. Robot. A brief introduction to Rami Malek's Mr. Robot first is Elliot Anderson is the character. Mr. Robot is the alter ego. And the character suffers from severe depression, also suffers from associative personality disorder, social anxiety disorder, feels alienated, and actually the first episode invites you to consider this character as a solipsistic character. He's really not sure if anyone else exists. But nonetheless, he feels like he's pitted against a society that he wants to take down. And he has superhuman powers in the sense that he's an expert hacker, maybe the world's best hacker. And he's such a good hacker that he's actually able to hack into, even in the first episode, we're not sure if this happens or not, or if he's dreaming it, and he's not sure if he's dreaming the world. I mean, the episode starts off with a black screen, and he's whispering, he's talking to you, but it turns out he thinks he's talking to himself. Toward the end of the spoiler alerts, but you'll still be able to appreciate the rest of the episode if you can. I mean, the rest of the season if you can get into it by knowing this up front. By the end of the episode, his hack works, and he's able to take down one of the top executives of E-Corps, which he refers to as Evil Corps. I mean, that's kind of on the nose, but he's able to take them down, and it's reported on national news. And right here, he's walking out into Times Square from his office job, where he's supposedly just an anonymous tech worker. And I'll let the clip speak for itself. Here we go. It's happening.
Bonsoir, Elliot.
Please tell me you're seeing this too.
Chcete dnes vydělat $1000?
I don't know what that guy said. Did he actually take down Evil Core? It's an open question in the series. But regardless, here's a solipsistic character that can teach us some things about our own approach or our own predicament. And he represents naturally the alienation side of the continuum. And the camera angles, the tone of the music and the color, the blurring of the background and foreground, all deliver a sense of alienation. And that remains the case throughout the series. I want to point out a few things that may have escaped your notice while you were looking at this. In all of the glitz and glamour of montage of multimodal expression in Times Square, you may have missed the little screen that flashed up a XXX mark, but I didn't because I'm attracted to the X pattern. This naturally didn't escape my attention either, and it's why I decided I have to try to watch the rest of the series to see how this fits in. But the fact that Elliot Anderson takes on a spread eagle pose in the middle of Times Square, but it immediately reverses from a state of triumph and elation into its opposite, a sense of despair in which he's concerned for his own life. Now let's shift over to the other extreme. And for this, I don't have a clip to play from one of the movies. I'm going to play the actual teaser trailer for the latest installment. The latest installment is still being released, but the last version of the film in 2017, the last sequel.
You know, they say the world is safer than it's ever been in the history of civilization. Do you feel safer today than you did yesterday? I know I don't. The world has changed. The war we're fighting today needs a different kind of soldier. We need people with the skills and the attitude to take on threats we don't even know exist.
We need someone who could walk into a tornado and come out the other side like it was a damn gentle breeze.
Get on your knees! So one in the dark, you could have just asked me. Pretty simple try for you. Kick some ass. And try to look dope while you do it. I could definitely make that work.
Guns, girls, global domination. Xander Cage is back.
Свет, как обычные люди. Но однажды...
Guns, girls, global domination. Now, I haven't even been able to make it through one of these movies. I'm sorry. I feel like a hypocrite talking about it, but the logo naturally is what drew me to this. I mean, trying to understand how it fits. And I think it's the kind of dynamic that's not, it's so unsubtle that you can get the point by watching the trailer. The triple X mark as a gestalt is best understood by understanding the meaning of X in isolation. and then the three coming together. And I'm going to return to that later. We'll look at single X, double X, triple X semiotics. First, before we go any further, I want to discuss this in the context of another X mark in semiotics called the semiotic square. How many of you are familiar with the semiotic square? From A.J. Gramos? You've come across it in a lot of your classes, I imagine. And even though my background is a bit more in American semiotics and Charles Sanders Peirce, because I'm fascinated by the X mark, I cannot ignore A.J. Gramos's contributions. Gramos himself actually argues that the semiotic square is a deep structure of human, cultural, and cognitive processes. He's not interested, however, in where those cognitive processes come from, evolutionarily or experientially. He himself is not even interested in the phenomenology, though a lot of contemporary Gramosians are starting to pay attention to how feeling maps on to structural semiotics. But my argument in this book, The Semiotics of X, part of my argument is that this, I agree with Gramos, that this is a deep structure of human culture and cognition, but it comes from the structure of our own bodily extremities in relation. One clue that we get that I'm right about this is the placement of the S1 term. The S1 term must go in the upper left. If you're thinking of this as a human body image, though, it's not the upper left, it's the upper right. When it comes to cultural organization, understanding oppositions is really important. Two mutually defining pairs, whether we're talking about light and dark, sun and moon, male and female, for better or for worse, well, for better and for worse, and these oppositions structure the way we think about things, and one of them tends to be privileged. Where do we get this idea that two things should be in opposition, but one of them is privileged? In most cultures around the world, regardless of language, family, and lineage, there's a privileging of right-handedness or laterality, and a suspicion cast on left-handedness. There's much more to the argument, but we'll leave it at that for now, thinking of this S1 term as the starting place. First of all, upper body is privileged over lower body, at least for manipulation and control of the world, and that has everything to do with our evolution, the reorganization of our anatomical planes, standing in an orthogonal 90-degree angle to the plane instead of being parallel to the plane. Our body image shifts dramatically. The role that this has played in evolution is not discussed much at all, but it should get a lot of press time. That's a longer, more involved argument, and I think it needs a lot more attention. But for now, we'll just stick with this S1 term as the unifying or the orienting point from which everything else, around which everything else is constructed. With this in mind, let me suggest that our domination-alienation nexus that we're interested in today is actually serving to undermine or call into question in much the same way that the function of our legs is in opposition to the function of our arms, but they work together to give us a more whole approach to the world. The evidence for this is actually explicit in the creation of these characters, especially in terms of Xander Cage. If you go back to some of these early movie posters, the tagline says something like a different kind of secret agent, the anti-James Bond. James Bond is a worldly, sophisticated, and civilized person. Xander Cage, the three X's have to do with Xander, his name starts with an X. And then he's also an extreme athlete. There's another X. And he's a secret agent. There's the third X. I mean, that's at least one argument. But then everything else about the film is also extreme, whereas James Bond is a subtle secret agent blending into society. Xander Cage is bent overtly on domination of every situation. He guns girls and global domination. Yeah. But back to the organizing gestalt. What we have here, and what all of these characters share in common, is that they have some sort of superhuman ability, and they have a double identity. The double identity aspect has to be hidden from others to some degree, and that may be the least obvious with Xander Cage. But the fact that he's both XXX and Xander Cage is one clue that he is participating in the same dynamics. The main oppositional relation runs from right to left. And below, if we're thinking of this as an embodied gestalt, then below the waistline, what you have on the lower right, if you're thinking of this as an embodied diagram with Xander Cage, is singly marked. What you have on the lower left with Mr. Robot is doubly marked. It's the most suspicious, you could say. But without it, nothing else would ultimately make sense. You can also say that what's up above generates what's below. In terms of the overall cultural processing, it may take time for the characters to be created, to respond to each other, but there's something about the overall organizing process that makes it make a kind of sense with everything else. And I think what's going on in terms of ordinary psychological processing has been best expressed by the poet Wallace Stevens. Let me just read this poem, and I'll come back to that point. This is a poem published in 1947, The Motive for Metaphor. You like it under the trees in autumn because everything is half dead. The wind moves like a cripple among the trees and repeats words without meaning. In the same way, you were happy in spring with the half colors of quarter things, the slightly brighter sky, the melting clouds, the single bird, the obscure moon. The obscure moon lighting an obscure world of things that would never be quite expressed, where you yourself were never quite yourself. It did not want nor have to be. Desiring the exhilaration of changes, the motive for metaphor, shrinking from the weight of primary noon, the ABC of being. The ruddy temper, the hammer of red and blue, the hard sound, steel against intimation, the sharp flash, the vital, arrogant, fatal, dominant, X. Some commentators of Wallace Stevens, people who have really been immersed in his poetry, find this poem very odd because, as one commentator says, he's usually reluctant to admit that a poem has to end. But here it seems like all of a sudden there's a huge shift and the poem abruptly ends. But I think that commentator is missing something, that with X here we have a pivot back to the beginning, that the poem cycles over again, because what Stephen understands, that I think we understand at a deep level but haven't yet come to admit to ourselves, that we ourselves are X. So we go back to the beginning of the poem where you are. The poem begins with a sense of familiarity, a sense of belonging in the world, but only through self-forgetfulness, which is not concerned with questions of solipsism or holism, but is concerned simply with the exhilaration of changes, not needing to control things, being able to be absorbed in imagination and absorbed in the worlds of other people and other people's experience are assumed to be just as important or more important than my own. But the problem won't go away because we're still faced with what he ends the poem with, the vital, arrogant, fatal, dominant X. It's a brilliantly composed line because it includes multiple kinds of dialectics in its own organization. Vital and arrogant are ameliorative adjectives. Fatal and dominant are a bit more harsh or pejorative adjectives and descriptions, and in that way we have a strict linear parallelism. But then, that's also there's also other dynamics like vital and fatal are mapped onto each other by their rhyming scheme. Arrogant and dominant map onto each other with their rhyming scheme, and in that sense we have other competing dynamics going on. But in terms of the semiotic square, life versus death, which is one of the most famous oppositions that we know of, naturally vital will go in the upper right of the embodied diagram, fatal in the upper left. And then what undermines those is the desire for domination and competition on one hand, and the arrogance that ends in alienation on the other hand. So these dialectics, poets help us pay attention to them. Comparative filmmaking helps us pay attention to them. But we know them firsthand in our bones, like our actual bone structure, our body memories. Maxine Sheets-Johnstone, the philosopher whose work I mentioned earlier, is a philosopher of dance. She argues that we have, that through body memory, we come to think of our body image in terms of lines. The lines that connect our limbs through our midline, if we're thinking about our body at outstretched extremities, such that our limbs are as far away from each other as they can be, and also our bodily topology is as exposed as it can be. That's the most extreme posture. So naturally it's going to be associated with extreme experiences. She argues that in order to map up, she doesn't talk about X specifically, but in terms of like dancing poses, I'm not a dancer, so I won't pretend, but to imagine linear structures, we have to use our imagination through our torso in order to map one limb to another. So it's partly felt, partly imagined, but this structure, let's come back to that and let's go into some of the other images. This structure appears through prehistory in cave art around the world. The embodied gestalt of spread eagle, we call it spread eagle in English, but we're at various degrees of remove. The one on the left here from India, the one that I've listed with B here is from the southeastern United States. On the C from Queensland, Australia, and it's actually an emu-human hybrid. And not all of these are men. The emu-human hybrid is a female, as you can see. And the one D here from a rock cliff in Italy, and there's actually a whole series of these. It's one of the most common themes or motifs in cave art around the world. I haven't seen much discussion on it. And those who do discuss it, like in this particular piece of cave art from Baja, California, in Mexico, it's from a cave called the Serpent Cave that is lit up at only one time of year, and at summer solstice, when the old year is giving way to the new year. And so one serpent is from mythology and oral traditions, One serpent is known to represent the old year, and the other serpent with antlers represents the new year. The cave is lit up at that time of year, and these figures surrounding, most of them have some degree or another of spread eagle posture. The only analysis done on this, that I've read anyways, devotes a few lines to it and calls it an orant gesture. Orant meaning prayer, a prayerful gesture. But that's what Göran Sonesson calls secondary iconicity. We don't know that that's what they're doing. We do know that whatever they're doing, it's extreme, because bodily posture is extremely exposed. The arms and legs are spread apart from each other. And the event it's depicting is an extreme event. Things are reversing in between the extremes. Another, the two on either side of the figure, the King Kong figure from Australia in the middle, are both from the southeastern United States. They're both also petroglyphs, and they're known to represent a different kind of extreme experience, the experience of a shamanic trance, or a lone individual going either through a coming of age ceremony or some other ceremony, going alone into the wilderness in order to pass a new kind of threshold. Whether the person is a shaman or someone coming of age. And the King Kong figure in the middle is also a liminal figure, a god, a representation of a god who's halfway in between life and death. Neither alive nor dead, and doesn't have thumbs, for what it's worth. So the figure itself is commonly used around the world. It's also part of what we know as extreme sports, coming back to Xander Cage, the extreme sports guy. We find the posture in a lot of extreme sports poses, but notice if you freeze the posture beyond the few seconds that the posture is enacted, then it easily becomes a form of torture, from extreme elation to extreme torture. This is notable anywhere from the crucifixion of St. Andrew to a traditional maritime punishment for soldiers, tying them up spread eagle, to the mast rigging, to this is the Native American group called the Natchez, who used to tie their enemies up spread eagle for torture. Contemporary Game of Thrones mythology, we may recognize that, and then ancient mythology as well, and contemporary mythology as well, and contemporary New York. This is intended to represent the stop and frisk program. So the figure is a figure of extreme experience and reversals between them. Notice the only two things that are different between the two is agentiveness and temporality. You extend the time frame and you take away personal freedom, and the extreme form of exhilaration turns into an extreme form of agony. The frozen figure of the hourglass is also depicted in the semiotic square. It's depicted in a lot of structuralist musings on the nature of cultural relationships through the 20th century, but it's also a frequently used image in visual design, whether we're talking about film posters or book designs. In this particular case, an art exhibition in the Netherlands. The hourglass figure is found in the structure of the Tibetan Wheel of Life, in which heaven is placed up and hell is placed down, and around which everything else is structured. Notice the nature of the embodied diagram here. And in India, it also represents, the upper half represents life, and the lower half represents death. Or better to say, the two in relation represent dialectics between life and death, between male and female. So this is something that's not just a preoccupation of structural theorists in the 20th century. It's part of the human experience that is reinterpreted in cultural artifacts at many different levels. It's part of a structure that enables us to think about relations between things, or the way that relationships tend to be. Maxine Sheets-Johnstone argues that this should come as no surprise. She's not a theorist of X, but she's a theorist of the dynamics that help us make sense of this. Since the body moves as an integrated whole, short of this fundamental kinetic integrity, we could hardly discover regularities. Thus, in both the phylogenetic, long evolutionary history, and ontogenetic, the development of the lifetime of the individual or the population, thinking is fundamentally modeled on the body. From a Peircean perspective, naturally, this is a kind of diagram. It's a diagram that we know from in our bones first, and then we can also use it to do abstract modeling. An icon is a sign that resembles something else, and a diagram is an icon of intelligible relations. And we construct an icon, Peirce says, of our hypothetical state of things, proceed to observe it. This observation leads us to suspect that something is true. In another place, he talks about it facilitating reasoning possibilities. So diagrams, we tend to think of them as visual, like a subway map, but they're also experiential, or maybe they're primarily experiential. This is something in Peircean semiotics that still needs a lot of work, but some people are starting to unpack this, that in Peirce's later semiotic theory, instead of talking about coalescing, sin signs, and legisigns at the iconic level of resemblance, he talks about tones, tokens, and types. The latter is a development of the former. But what it enables us to realize is that all iconic relations at the diagrammatic level, where you have multiple part-whole relationships that are pointing to something else, are grounded in, or another way of saying it is, the sign vehicle of an iconic object is always a felt, emotional, kinesthetic state of being, something that is profoundly experiential, not just abstracted. So I've called this the effective quality of all iconic relations, but I would recommend Marc Champagne's book, 2018 Consciousness and the Philosophy of Signs, for doing the hard work of drawing attention to this. The frozen X diagram that tends toward torture, and because it's not just immediately experienced and then you can relax, but frozen in this posture of impossibilities, has been called by Tyler, building on the work of Heidegger, who's building on the work of Hegel, naturally, a diagram of absolute difference. And so it's no wonder when this diagram shows up, you have a sense that the center cannot hold. And a lot of people have identified that same sense with modernity or hyper-modernity, that the center cannot hold. That's the sense that we get in the two characters that we're looking at today. It's the sense that you get in this art gallery representation on the nature or the illusion of money, that it's a system that will eventually collapse on itself. It's what you get in this absolute competition between Jung and Freud that we know eventually resulted in the two splitting from each other. It's what you get in this film poster in which you have a hyperbolic grain of sand in the boulder, and you know that the character is the next drop of sand to fall. But the deeper underlying experience is the upper and lower limbs. You can see this in the diagrammatic relations that I've already mentioned. It's part of the experience of the Dylan Thomas poem. It's part of Lacan's basic approach to psychoanalysis, in which he argues that through these dotted lines, that the self is ultimately cut off from the other, which is another representation of implicit solipsism. And in these two diagrams from decidedly non-Western contexts, both of them involve inverted images, dialectic relations, cyclical dynamics, and closed structures, and they point to catastrophic ends. I mean, in the case of the Buddhist wheel of life, in this diagram from Tibetan Buddhism, the whole purpose of the diagram is to remind you that you're going to die, and it's just a matter of time. And so, where are you going to be reborn, or can you actually get off of the whole thing and go to nirvana and exist in a state of enlightenment? So, in the meantime, you're going to be immersed in suffering and death, impermanence and doom, and the whole point of the monster Yama is to lock you in his gaze to help you come to grips with that fact. And then in Hindu mythic traditions, this particular drum structure has these associations and is associated with both life and death, but it's also oriented to crisis and mortality and the impermanence of things. I realize that time is running on, and I don't want to take more time than has been allotted. So let me go back to the focal images with this in mind and suggest a slight variation on the theme that I think is already suggested, but it goes beyond the kinesthetic sense of embodiment to a different kind of embodied X. The embodied X of parallactic vision or binocular vision. Our left eye and our right eye converge and give us a sense of three-dimensional space. We can better understand how these sets of focal images, by comparing them with each other, which is the only way to do semiotics according to Göran Sonesson, or the best way. Comparing them to each other, we come to a more full vision of how they're working, both as the necessary opposition, so they create each other in a way, but also they exist in order to undermine other kinds of hyperbolic, superhuman references that seem to give ourselves a sense of understanding of the cultural order that we live in. This kind of semiotic parallax at multiple removes suggests what Peirce calls an assemblage of symptoms. They're clues, and multiple clues that taken together form a kind of aggregate argument, you could say, that is not only an entity or a bunch of facts that compute to one fact, but necessarily a concrete thing, something, in spite of the fact that it may be intangible, is actually a real organizing force. If we can see it, we can work within it or work against it. We at least know how to talk about it. That's what I would like to suggest, and now I would like to talk about it. Thank you.